The title of my presentation is Shortcuts to Trophy Deer Management. And the full presentation, I talk about 10 different management techniques that can be used for fine-tuning a trophy deer management program. But with limited time, I'm going to shorten it down to 3 or 4 of the most important trophy deer management techniques or methods. And if we can get the next slide. And so the first set of tools I'm going to talk about regarding trophy deer management is harvest management. Another way to put harvest management, or at least with relative to my talk, is culling. Is there room for a culling program and a trophy deer management program? The good news is that thanks to the South Texas Buck Capture Project, we now know the answers to 3 really important questions in regard to harvest management. The questions are, when does antler size peak for white-tailed deer in South Texas? Are spikes inferior to fork-antlered yearling bucks? And what culling criteria are the best to implement on your ranch for a trophy deer management program? The first question was, when does antler size peak? And we have really good data, scientific data, that shows that in South Texas, gross Boone-and-Crockett scores don't peak until a buck reaches 5 to 7 years old. Gross Boone-and-Crockett scores increase as a buck increases in age from 1 to 5, and then once a buck hits 5 years old, it levels off from 5 to 7. It kind of reaches a plateau. And in South Texas, a mature buck on average will gross score 130 Boone-and-Crockett inches. The next slide is in reference to spikes. Are spikes inferior? Well, based on our South Texas Buck Capture Project, we found that they were. If you compare average gross Boone-and-Crockett scores for spike-antlered yearlings versus fork-antlered yearlings, at every age from 1.5 through 7.5, the fork-antlered group outscores the spike-antlered group 14 to 22 inches, depending on the age class. But the top pie chart is for the spike group. These are yearling bucks with 2 or 3 antler points that we later recaptured at 5 to 7 years old. And nearly 70% of the spike group never reached 130 Boone-and-Crockett inches at full maturity. So 70% of the spikes at full maturity end up gross scoring under 130 inches. Contrast that to the yearling bucks with 6 or more antler points, and that's the pie chart at the bottom of the slide. Nearly 40% of yearling bucks with 6 or more antler points end up gross scoring above 160 inches at maturity. So a big difference between the spike group and the group of yearling bucks with 6 or more antler points in terms of the percentage that'll end up above 160. 0% of the spikes and nearly 40% of the 6-point yearlings. The culling criteria that we developed from the South Texas Buck Capture Project are shown on the slide, and these are relatively conservative criteria. In other words, you can safely remove bucks in these categories and not really have any risk of shooting a buck that's got the potential to turn into a trophy buck. So they're conservative with very little risk in making a mistake. And the criteria are any yearling buck or any buck of any age, regardless of age, that's unforked on one side. He's a spike, at least a spike on one side. Regardless of the age, that would be one culling category. A second category is any buck 3.5 or older with 7 or fewer total antler points. A third category is any buck 4 years old or older with 8 or fewer total antler points. And a fourth category, any mature buck that's 5.5 years old or older that gross scores under 130 inches. Landowners should make every buck in their deer herd that meets these criteria available to their hunters to harvest. Now, we heard the good news. We have really good information on when antler size peaks, whether or not spikes are inferior, and what culling criteria are best. Now the bad news, no amount of culling through hunter harvest can change deer population genetics. On any property, anywhere that I'm aware of, no amount of culling can effectively change deer population genetics. That's the bad news. I can't really see this slide from here, but it's a slide based on data from the King Ranch, where we conducted an intensive culling study for 7 years. We had a 9,000 acre treatment area where we removed as many cull bucks as we could through hunter harvest, and over 7 years, each fall before the hunting season, we did a random buck capture by helicopter and net gun, and randomly captured as many bucks as we could on that 9,000 acre treatment area. And we compared the gross Boone and Crockett scores of those bucks by age class to bucks randomly captured on a 9,000 acre control area. And after 7 years of intensive culling, there was absolutely no difference in the two deer herds between the control herd and the treatment herd in terms of average gross Boone and Crockett scores. So 7 years of intensive culling resulted in zero change or zero difference between the treatment area where we did the culling and the control area where there was no culling. More recently, the folks at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M University Kingsville conducted a even more intensive culling study on the Comanche Ranch in Maverick County. And they had 3 different study areas. One was the control area where they didn't do any culling. A second area was 18,000 acres, high fenced, where they only culled in the age classes 3.5 and older. And then they had a third study area that was 3,500 acres, high fenced, where they very intensively removed cull bucks. And I'm going to focus on that particular treatment, the 3,500 acres, high fenced. The King Ranch study, by the way, was low fenced, which confounded the study. In this example, it's 3,500 acres, high fence. They used a helicopter and a net gun to capture bucks from the 3,500 acres every fall before the breeding season. And then once they had a buck netted and on the ground, they measured the antlers, they looked at the teeth to determine the age of the buck, and they used those 2 characteristics to determine whether or not the buck was a cull. If it was a cull buck, if it qualified as a cull, they euthanized it right there. If it did not qualify as a cull, they released it. So there was zero mistakes made. All of the bucks were removed before the breeding season, and that's something you just can't replicate in the wild with hunters. You can't do it any other way more effectively than what they did. And after 7 years of intensively removing bucks from the 3,500 acre treatment area, just as was the case with the King Ranch, they found zero difference between the control area and the treatment area. And these were the criteria that they used for removing captured bucks from the treatment area. Any yearling buck they caught with less than 6 points, they euthanized. Any buck 2.5 years old or older with less than 8 points, they euthanized. Any buck 3 to 4 years old with less than 9 points, they removed it from the population. And any mature buck 5.5 years old or older that gross scored under 145 inches, they removed it from the population. What they found was that gross Boone and Crockett score by age, the heritability values of the antler traits that go into calculating gross Boone and Crockett score increase as a buck gets older in age. It's fairly low heritability, around 25% for yearling bucks, but that increases to around 45% for bucks 3.5 and older. And after 7 years of intensively removing cull bucks by helicopter in the 3,500 acres high fenced, by the 7th year of the study, the vast majority of fawns that were sired by mature bucks versus young bucks or middle-aged bucks. So they were effective in limiting the breeding to only mature bucks through their culling program. But, like I said earlier, just as was the case with the King Ranch study, the folks doing the culling study at the Comanche Ranch found no difference between the control area or the treatment area after 7 years of very, very, very intensive culling. And so why doesn't culling change genetics? The biggest reason, and probably the real reason we'll never be able to do it effectively through hunter harvest is that 50% of the genetics are determined by the doe. And I don't know anybody that knows an accurate way to tell whether or not a doe is a cull. And so without being able to address half of the deer herd in a culling program, you're not going to effectively make any changes through culling. Another reason culling would be difficult to implement in the wild with any success is that antler values have a relatively low heritability. In other words, you're judging the buck by what he's wearing on top of his head, and that ends up not being a very, very reliable characteristic as to whether or not that buck is a cull buck or not. Another reason is that in the wild, outside of a pen, bucks on average sire only around 1 to 1.5 fawns per buck per year. And so you have a whole lot of different individual bucks participating in the breeding, and you don't have any individual bucks that are monopolizing the breeding. And so the breeding spread out over almost the entire buck population. And really, to have any effect in culling, you have to be as far right on that continuum as possible. The smaller the property, and it has to be high fenced. The farther you move toward the right side of that continuum line, the more effective culling would be. Despite the lack of genetic change with culling, I still highly, highly recommend culling for the reasons that are outlined on that slide. First and foremost, I recommend culling because of the increased hunter recreation that's available when a culling program is implemented. Secondly, culling program reduces your feed bill. You have a lot fewer mouths in your feeder and on the habitat. A third reason for implementing a culling program is that you can influence the standing crop by removing cull bucks that hunting season. By the end of that hunting season, what's left out there, the standing crop, you can effectively change the standing crop by removing the cull bucks and leaving only the larger antlered bucks in the population. For ranches that are commercially hunting deer, having a culling program opens up the ability to sell hunts for cull bucks and management bucks. So you can supplement your income by having a culling program. In a situation where you're at or above the carrying capacity of the habitat, a culling program can positively influence the amount of nutrition available for remaining deer by removing mouths off the habitat and providing more resources for the deer that remain alive after the culling program. That slide on the screen there shows the overall buck harvest on the King Ranch. The yellow portions of the bars are trophy bucks. The percentage of the buck harvest made up of trophy bucks, and the orange portion of the bars are cull bucks. I worked as the chief wildlife biologist for the King Ranch for 12 years. When I started there in 1999, I implemented a culling program where we made spikes, 3.5-year-old and older bucks with 7 or less points, and 5.5-year-old and older bucks gross scoring under 130 inches. We made those available on an unlimited basis to our lease hunters to shoot. And as a result of allowing them to shoot spikes and cull bucks and not have those count toward their limited buck harvest quotas, we were able to quadruple the buck harvest on the King Ranch. With the culling program, we were killing 4 times as many bucks as we were before the culling program. So the take-home messages regarding harvest management. In a trophy program, ideally you want to delay the harvest of your trophy class bucks or your bucks with trophy potential until they're 5 to 7 years old. Spikes are inferior, so they can be harvested in a culling program, but shooting spikes will not influence genetics. The culling criteria, I've already described those a couple of times. And then finally, it's really clear now with the 2 studies, the King Ranch study and the study at the Comanche Ranch, that culling will not result in any population change in genetics. The next topic I was going to cover is water development in a trophy deer management program. I learned the hard way through one of my clients that deer cannot survive without freestanding water. In college, I was taught that deer could at least maintain themselves with pre-formed water alone. That's the water that they get from the vegetation that they eat Well, in South Texas, in a drought situation, you have to have freestanding water available to the deer herd or you're going to have deer die. They can't survive with just preformed water that's in the forage that they eat. The bottom line is the more water sources you have available to your deer herd, the better. And the ideal situation is to provide permanent water at every one of your feeder locations. How many of you are familiar with Texas Parks and Wildlife's Deer Management Permit Program? It's a permit program available through Parks and Wildlife that allows you to live capture the biggest buck on your ranch, along with up to 20 does on your ranch and put them into a pen that's at least 5 acres in size on your ranch. Now to qualify, your ranch has to be entirely high fenced. What that does is that allows you to ensure that your biggest buck breeds 20 does. And from that, you're going to get an average of about 30 fawns out of that one buck. Without the DMP, that buck out in the wild, on average, will only produce about 1.5 fawns per year outside of the pen. But you put them in a pen, you get about 30 fawns out of them versus 1.5. So that's why that's why the DMP permit program is getting so popular, is to ensure that your biggest bucks do sire a lot of fawns each year. And so one result from a DMP permit is that you get big fawn crops and you have high fawn survival. My experience through my clients is that probably the best combination is to use a breeder buck as a sire in your DMP pen combined with up to 20 wild native does from your ranch. You get quicker results that way than you do using a wild buck versus a breeder buck. A lot of you in this room are deer breeders. A lot of the members of TDA are deer breeders. And quite a few of my clients have a breeder facility on their ranch, and they're using breeder deer in some form or fashion in their trophy deer management program. And through my clients, I've learned some tips to success in using breeder deer. And if you're in South Texas, the first rule of thumb is to avoid deer with any northern blood in their genetics, if at all possible. Second tip to success using breeder deer for stocking purposes on your ranch is to release breeder deer as young in age as possible. The younger the deer is when you release it on your ranch for stocking purposes, the better it's going to survive, the more productive it's going to be. And this slide shows what I'm talking about. And this is 27 years of data collected by Dr. Harry Jacobson based on breeder deer releases that he did in Northeast Texas. And he found the highest survival when he released breeder deer that were 6 to 10 months old. 80% of his buck fawns and doe fawns, when released that spring, survived at least 1 year. And around 65 to 70% survived at least 2 years. The older the breeder deer were when he released them, the poorer the survival. If he waited until the breeder deer were yearling deer, survival dropped off in the middle set of bars there. And if he waited until they were 2 years old or older, survival dropped way off. So the best thing to do for stocking purposes is to release your breeder deer as young as possible, 6 to 10 months of age. And finally, I have some slides here on supplemental feeding, implications with trophy deer management. All 4 of these bucks in this slide are bucks out in the wild on one of my clients' ranches. They're all products of the DMP permit program. All 4 of those bucks were born inside a DMP pen, and then they were hand captured as fawns and ear tagged and turned out that following October onto the ranch. And because they're captured as fawns, they're of known age, and the ages are right there on the slide for each buck. But you can see how successful that program is right there in that one slide. Is supplemental feeding necessary? Yes, because maximizing nutrition is absolutely necessary. In fact, maximizing nutrition should be the primary goal for every deer manager. Landowners and managers should take whatever steps are necessary within the constraints of their budget to ensure that nutrition is never limiting for their deer herd. In Texas, improving nutrition is even more important than in other states because rainfall is highly variable from year to year and even from season to season. In Texas, rainfall more than any other factor determines the nutritional level of your habitat. There are 3 ways to improve nutrition for your deer herd. One is to provide supplemental feed. The second method is to manipulate the native habitat. And the third method is to install food plots. Unfortunately, rainfall is necessary in South Texas to influence the native habitat and to plant food plots. So you're really left with only one option, and that is to implement a supplemental feeding program. And in my opinion, a supplemental feeding program is the single most important management tool available. A year-round supplemental feeding program will do more to improve your deer herd than any other management practice. Take-home message is feeder density on your ranch. If you want to have a population level impact on the deer herd, feeder density needs to be a minimum of 1 feeder per 200 acres, and ideally even higher at a density of 1 feeder per 100 acres if you want to get feed to the doe segment of the deer herd and to the fawns. And don't even bother buying time release feeders. You have to have free choice feeders that you feed the deer herd with so that the feed's available 24/7, 365. Gross Boone-Crockett scores for the bucks that eat your supplemental feed will be on average about 15% higher than they would be without the supplemental feed. Ideally, you should provide supplemental feed year-round, but if your budget won't allow you to feed 12 months out of the year, the next best option is to, as a minimum, is to feed from February through August so that you cover the entire antler growing period. And I guess a good thing and a bad thing about supplemental feeding is it's going to take at least 10 years before you see the full benefits of your feeding program, because you need to have the deer currently on your ranch when you implement a feeding program have their fawns, and then those fawns have fawns, and then that second generation of buck fawns, they need to grow up to maturity on supplemental feed before you see the full effects of your supplemental feeding program. So it takes a long time to see the full benefit, but the good news is each year you're going to see a marked improvement in your deer herd until you reach that 10-year time frame.